Tonight it's a tremendous honour and privilege for Wadham College to welcome Marla Tribich to speak to us. Marla was born in a town in Poland in 1930, and she was one of the very few survivors when the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp was liberated by the British Army in April 1945. Her experiences during the war, in the ghetto, as a slave labourer, and then as a concentration camp prisoner, will be the subject of her talk this evening. This is a talk which Marla has given many, many times over the last 25 years to schools and colleges across the United Kingdom and elsewhere as part of the Holocaust Education Trust's work to educate and to promote understanding, not just about the Holocaust, but about intolerance and what flows from it. And Marla's work for the Holocaust Educational Trust has been absolutely extraordinary over recent years. Indeed, in 2012, she was awarded an MBE by the Queen in the Jubilee Honours List in recognition of the work that she's done. I'm really delighted that Marla has found time to fit us into her schedule in this, the 70th year of her liberation. I know that she's been back to Belsen on a few occasions. Indeed, she went back this year for various commemorative events. It's difficult for any of us to imagine what it must be like to return to that place, but Marla, we do admire your extraordinary energy and your commitment to the work that you do, and welcome this evening to Wadham College.
It is a privilege actually to be here at this very well known and wonderful college. You will appreciate that I have to condense 5.5 years into about an hour, so you'll only hear a little bit of what happened during those 5.5 years during the Second World War. Now, as Ken said, I was born in a town in Poland, which is called Piotrków Trybunalski. I discard the second part, it's too complicated. And I'll just tell you about my pre-war life, which I won't concentrate on because my life before the war was just very ordinary of that period. I did all the usual things. I went to school. I played with my friends. We went on holiday. It was, but it was a life which was in a loving family with lots of cousins and friends. But unfortunately, all this came to an end very abruptly on the 1st of September 1939, when the Second World War broke out. Now, Poland was, as you probably know, was invaded very quickly. The invasion, it only took 2 weeks before they were in throughout Poland, and it was, Poland was completely unprepared for that war. Now, my town, which, as you saw, is fairly near the German border, maybe for that reason, that my town had the first ghetto in Poland. And it started within 2 months of the beginning of the war. So by the 1st of November 1939, we were forced out of our homes and into the ghetto, and that was really a prototype of what was to come, because later on there were ghettos in most of the towns. Now, the ghetto is actually a subject of its own, because there was so much to the ghetto. First of all, my town had a population of about 55,000, of whom 15,000 were Jewish. But at its height, the ghetto had 28,000 people in it, and you may wonder why. And that is because that section between the German border and my town was immediately annexed. It became part of the German Reich, and it was made what they call in German Judenfrei. And which means free of Jews. And people from those areas were either deported to our town, or some of them came of their own accord because they had relatives or friends. And 28,000 people were pushed into this very small area. The overcrowding was such that there could be as many as 8 to 10 people in a room, could be 3 families per room. And one of the things that people very often ask me, what was the worst thing? That everything was terrible. But one of the things that I really personally felt, and I'm sure other people did too, is the loss of privacy. When you had to share a room with strangers, but of course it got much worse, and then we had to share a bed with strangers, same sex, but nevertheless, very, very crowded and embarrassing and not very pleasant. Now, the ghetto was at first what we called an open ghetto, but of course we were not allowed out of it. People over the age of 12 had to wear a white band with a blue Star of David on the forearm, but only people over, over 12, so it didn't apply to me. I was just approaching my 9th birthday when the war started. I was still effectively 8. And so I remember it as a girl between the ages of 9 and 14, which was the age when I was liberated. So it took quite a lot of years. And it was a sort of gradual progression from bad to worse. Now there were curfews. We're not allowed out on the streets after 8 o'clock. At various times it was after 5 o'clock we're not allowed out. Food was very short. Sanitary conditions were very poor, and this caused a lot of epidemics. So people were dying from that. And of course, the Germans, the people in charge, the German soldiers with their rifles patrolling all the time, they were very, very quick to use them. It didn't take very much for them to shoot someone. Our lives became so vulnerable, and they were just hanging on a thread, because we couldn't be sure that we'll survive another day. You could just go out into the street and not come back. Food was very short, but we were really trying to survive on whatever, on our possessions, because we were able to trade things, like valuable things, for food. My father had a lot of connections outside because he had been in business. He actually had a flour mill in partnership with others, and he knew a lot of people, so we were marginally better off. And it was a sort of microcosm of, people, of say a town, but it was, there were always people who were better off, people who were worse off, people who managed to do things that others didn't. And of course, school for Jewish children finished immediately. I won't concentrate on the ghetto too much, only to say that after 2.5 years, rumors started circulating that the ghetto was going to be liquidated and everybody was going to be deported, except people with work permits. Now, those who had work permits were very, very lucky. It was like a passport for life, but nothing really guaranteed life at that time. So only people of a certain age had any chance of survival. The middle section, they were not interested in preserving children or old people. So sort of everybody felt insecure, and well, we were sort of facing death all the time. But when this sort of the rumors started, we didn't know the dates or exactly what was going to happen, but we did know that the deportation would lead to the camps, which not even concentration camps, but the death camps. Nobody would come out alive. Nobody did come alive out of those, like Tribich and Sobibor and Belzet. And some people started making arrangements to try and save themselves. There were various ways. Some people had friends outside who would hire one or two members of the family. Some people tried to smuggle themselves out of the ghetto, live in sewers or in the open. And, well, there were various means. Some people were saving Jews for money. And my parents, together with my aunt and uncle, Joseph Klein, found somebody to take me and my cousin Ija to Częstochowa, the place I pointed out to you on the map. It's so very close to the border, it's on the border. And because it's on the border, there were a lot of ethnic Germans living there as well. And this was an ethnic German who was prepared to take 2 Jewish girls to hide during the deportations. Arrangements were made, I won't go into details, and this was something that this man was going to be well paid for. And because he was of German origin, we were going to be even safer with him, and therefore, it was dearer. Now, the arrangements were that he would take us, we would be smuggled out of the ghetto, we'll travel to Częstochowa, but one at a time, because it was too dangerous to take 2 Jewish children on a train on false papers when they were constantly checking and looking at the papers. And the important thing was that even though we had our papers, we didn't look Jewish, whatever that perception is. The thing is that it's one thing you cannot hide. We were hiding our identities. But if you are scared, the fear shows in your eyes. And that's something, because we were constantly thinking that they're coming for us. There was actually a reward for handing in Jews, and some people made quite a sort of a good living on that. And so we were constantly thinking, if someone looked for us for longer than a few seconds, we thought, he sussed us out. And we were sort of metaphorically looking over our shoulder all the time. But anyway, it all happened. We got to Częstochowa a week, one at a time, a week apart. And there we found ourselves on the outskirts in a house with middle-aged couple, not the man who came for us, because he was their son-in-law and he lived nearby with his wife and a child. And they weren't exactly thrilled to have us, but they tolerated us, and they didn't ill-treat us or anything. But we were very scared, very vulnerable, very homesick. And my cousin Ija was in such a state over it, she really couldn't bear to be away from her parents. She was an only child. I was one of 3 children, the middle one. I had an older brother, Ben, and I have still, and her younger sister, Lucia. And but Ija was an only child. I don't know whether that contributed towards it, but she couldn't bear it. She was so homesick, she asked to be taken home. And she was told that that's not possible because the deportations are still going on. But she said, we have very good friends in Piotrków who are hiding our valuables. They will take me, and please take me to them. And they said, okay, and I thought how lucky she was to have gone back, and I'm still languishing there, and I don't know how long, I don't know the dates, but it seemed like a very, very long time. And eventually the time came for me to go back, And you know, I haven't described to you what it was like to actually live there and the fear of it. Because, for instance, I'll just give you one example and stop at that. But sometimes when there was a knock on the door, it was okay for us to mix with whoever came in. Other times, they would quickly hide us somewhere, under the bed, in a cupboard, anywhere out of sight. So we never knew where we were. And on one occasion, when we were mixing, one of the visitors started a conversation with me, and he said, "I hear that you're visiting your relatives from Warsaw." That's what we're supposed to be. I said, "Yes." And he said, "Where do you live in Warsaw?" And by then I was so terrified that he has sussed me out, and he's going to hand me over, report me to the Gestapo. I forgot my address that I was supposed to have. And I actually had the presence of mind to make one up. And it was okay, it passed. But had he sort of questioned me further, he wasn't really suspicious. I don't think he even thought for a minute I was Jewish. But had he questioned me about Warsaw, but at that time I hadn't even visited Warsaw, I probably wouldn't have known the answers. So that's just one small incident. There were lots of different ones. But my cousin really couldn't take it, and they agreed to take her back to these very, very good friends. Now, when my time came to go back, arrangements were made for me to be handed over to my father in the flour mill, on the top floor of the flour mill in Piotrków, which before the war belonged to him with partners, but now he was lucky to have a job there. And when we arrived, there was my father, but also my uncle, Ija's father, Joseph Klein. He looked at us and he turned white. He said, "Where's my daughter?" And the men said, "We brought her back. We took her to your friends." He mentioned them by name. And he said, "But she's not there. Where is she? What have you done with my child?" And I still remember vividly my uncle pacing up and down saying, "What have you done with my child?" And this is the end of the story. Nobody knows what happened to each other. And around that time also, there was sort of roundup of various people, among them my uncle and his brother Marcus Klein, and my father and his brother Fischl Helfgott, and some other people, and a few people were released, my father among them, but my uncle was among the people who were taken. Well, they were imprisoned originally, but then they were taken to the Jewish cemetery and they were all shot there. So my aunt had lost her husband and her daughter within a very short time. She survived the war. And when we met up after the war, her first priority was to quickly return to Poland and try and find these people, but they were gone. They had disappeared. There was no trace of them, no trace of Ija. It was impossible to find anything. So we didn't often, whenever we met up, we didn't often speak about Ija because first of all, we didn't know very much, but she knew a little more than I did. And she told me that this man actually turned up with Ija to these friends. They collected a suitcase full of valuable things, and they left with Ija in the suitcase. And my aunt said to me, "How could anybody do away with a child for the sake of some goods? I would have given them everything I possessed if only they had saved her." And that's the pain she lived with for the rest of her life. Now, at that time, I was handed over to my father, and I returned to the ghetto with the working party, which was a long column of men, and you would think, well, a little girl by the side, nobody will notice. But in fact, it wasn't like that, because they were always searching and counting and looking. But at that time, they didn't, because they knew that some people, the deportations were finished. The ghetto was now reduced from its size, which wasn't all that big, but it was now 2 half streets, and there were 2,400 people left out of the 28,000. And so they weren't searching. They knew some people had saved themselves outside, and they let them filter back. They didn't look. But little did we know that we were walking into a trap. When I returned, my mother and sister were there, because they had also been in hiding, but nearer home. I don't even know where they were, but they were there, they were safe. My father and brother had work permits, so my family was still intact. But that was very unusual, because most families had been dissipated. There may have been 1 or 2 members left, and most families disappeared altogether. And we were living in the ghetto for a little while together in a part of a room, when they started searching for all these, what they called illegals, the people who they had returned without work permits. And on one occasion, they burst into a room where my mother's sister was with a lot of other people. And they took them all away to this synagogue that you see. And there they were kept without any food or water, and that was in December, freezing weather, no heating. They were surrounded by Ukrainian soldiers with their rifles who used to patrol, and out of boredom, they would just shoot into the windows, and they would kill people or injure them. And on the 20th of December, 1942, they marched them out of the synagogue in groups of 50 at dawn to the nearby forest called Rakov. And there, when they arrived, they found their mass graves ready, waiting for them. And they were killed in the most horrific way. We know what happened because there were witnesses who came to tell us. But it's something I don't repeat, I can't. And, but I can tell you that it is very well documented in many books. But one of the better books, well, excellent book, is by Christopher Browning, a distinguished American historian, who has written in great detail about what happened. And these killings were taking place all over Europe in forests. And it's a whole big subject of its own. The biggest one, and very well known one, was Babi Yar, where the numbers were enormous, and there's actually a book about that called Babi Yar. Now, having lost my mother and sister, there were still 3 of us. The ghetto was, they were still rounding people up, even sometimes people with permits, with working permits. And on one occasion they rounded up my aunt, the Healthcot side, who was taken away screaming, who will look after, she had already lost her husband, and she said, who will look after my child. And by that time, I was the only female member of the family left, and it was down to me. And my cousin Anne was 5, and I was 12 by then. Now, soon after that, they liquidated the ghetto altogether, and all the people with working permits were either at work, or the others, because of the working shifts, they were inside the ghetto. But there were still illegal people. I mean, I wasn't legal, nor was my cousin. And they were still searching. They searched out all those without permits, took them outside, and they were being deported. Now, I was among them. So outside the ghetto, outside the barbed wire, there was this column of us standing there, and lorries were arriving and taking people away. And, you know, any deportation always was very terrifying, and I hadn't witnessed any until this one, but that was comparatively small. And we were standing there, the woman in front of me, she was there with the baby in her arms, and suddenly she was hit over the head with a rifle butt, and she was crying, the baby was screaming, her head was bleeding. It was all really, really scary. And watching all this was a German officer on the corner. He wasn't actually doing it. He was in charge, but he wasn't doing anything, just watching what, you know, how it was taking place. And I don't know what gave me the idea, but I stepped out of line. I went up to him and said that I have been separated from my father and brother. They're inside the ghetto. Can I go back to them? And he looked at me flabbergasted that I either had the audacity or the courage, but he actually had a kind face and he smiled. He didn't say much to me, but he called a policeman and said, "Take her back." And on the way, I said, "Just a minute, my cousin, I've got to pick up my cousin." And he said, "You can't because she hasn't had permission." And I said, "Well, I can't go back and ask." And anyway, I argued until he let me take her, and we were both back in the ghetto with my father and brother, so there were the 4 of us. The ghetto was then liquidated, and we were allocated to, there were 2 places of work that really became labor camps. But they were, one was a glass works and one was a plywood factory. But it wasn't just a factory, they made plywood from the, basic, they had delivered the trunks, and then they went through the whole process. And when the plywood was made, then it was made into sections for tents. We called them tents, but they were plywood tents, which were then packaged and sent to the front for the German army. Now, at that time, I became a slave laborer at the age of 12. My cousin Anne, who was absolutely terrified of losing me, she clung to me, but she had no choice about me going to work. In the barracks where we lived, there were other women who sort of kept an eye on her. And of course, my father and brother were at the other end of this enormous compound. It was the barracks and the men, and I was with the women. Now, life became much harder. We were working very long shifts. We had very little food. And again, I won't dwell on this, but because time is flying. We were there about 18 months when they decided to deport us. And this time we walked to the railway station, and there the men were sent one way, the women, they're always kept separately, and I know now that the men ended up in Buchenwald, and the women were sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Now, when we arrived, the first thing they did was take everything away from us that we brought with us. Then we had to queue up, and we had to give our details, because you know the Germans were meticulous at record keeping. Then we had to undress, our clothing was taken away. Our heads were shaved, we went through cold communal showers, and when we came out the other end, we were given the concentration camp garb, the striped jacket and skirt. And when we looked at one another, we really couldn't recognize each other. We just looked all the same. We were just an object. There was no individuality. We didn't recognize each other. It had a terrible effect on us, because during that time, the one thing that kept us going was hope. Without hope, one couldn't survive. And suddenly we felt this loss of hope, loss of any sort of chance that we might survive. We really felt that was the end. Because after all, what we are is how we look, and it's our personalities, and they've taken all that, and by then we had been going through the war for over 5 years. They'd taken everything from us, our families, our possessions, but now we felt as if they had taken our very soul, and we won't survive. And this was reflected in how people started dying very quickly. My aunt, Franja Klein, who was on the transport, died within a few days of arrival. My best friend, Pema Blachman, died soon after that. People were just giving up. Now, I won't tell you a lot about the camp itself. It was a very well organized, very well run camp, and the thing that stands out is the appel, which is like the roll call. We had to be outside on this Appellplatz, 6 o'clock every morning, and they would count us. And while they were counting us, of course, people were dying, they're doing recounts, they're going off for coffee, we could stand there for hours. Our food was half a slice of black bread, not to be mistaken for the nutritious black bread, something called soup, a sort of grey liquid, and something coffee. They called it ersatz coffee, which means imitation coffee, and occasionally a novel of margarine. Some people worked, I didn't work. We were only there between 2 and 3 months, maybe 2.5 months. I don't have the exact dates. I didn't know what the dates were at the time. I've researched some of them. And after 2.5 months, they deported us again. And this time, after a shorter journey, because the previous journey was so long, I didn't know how long, but I did actually find a record of it. It was 4.5 days. In very crowded conditions, with people dying, there's no food or water, and the dead and the living people were traveling together. But this time the journey was shorter, and on arrival we found ourselves in Bergen-Belsen. Now I'm sure everybody's heard of Bergen-Belsen. When I speak to school, I always ask them, and because they're so far removed from that period that they're not sure, but I think that they're getting to know what it was all about, because it is on their curriculum, they're learning that subject. Now, Bergen-Belsen was so different from Ravensbrück. First of all, when we got off the trains, they were there to greet us, the Germans, with their rifles shouting, their dogs barking, and they were shouting Raus, Raus, and Schnell, which means fast. and we're jumping off this train, and we walked to Bergen-Belsen. There, they were so full up, they had no room for us, they put us up in a tent outside. The next morning, and the tent was very big, very overcrowded with lots of different nationalities, different languages. But the next morning they took us into the camp. And what we saw defies description, and I'm sure that you have seen some of the images. But I can just briefly tell you that the first thing that struck you was the smell. A terrible smell and a smog, and people, they were really skeletons, and they were just shuffling along like zombies, and they'd just collapse and die. You could be speaking to someone, and they'd die in front of you. And there were dead bodies everywhere. There were piles piles of individuals, and also piles of there were naked, decaying corpses. It was just a terrible sight. Now, we were shown into barracks, which was very overcrowded, like they all were. A place like that, which should have held 80 to 100 people, could have as many as 1,000. But I heard that there was a children's home somewhere in the camp, and I set out to find it with my cousin. Now, we were interviewed by two women, a Dr. Wimko and Sister Luba. And they asked us a lot of questions, and then they turned to me and said, well, we are also very overcrowded, but in any case, you, pointing at me, are too old for this children's home. So I said, okay, I understand, will you take my cousin? And of course they would, but there was no way Anne was going to stay without me. And it's quite a long story about how eventually they relented and they took us in. And that really saved our lives. I'm sure we wouldn't have survived on the main camp. Now, this children's home was actually, it's got a very interesting story of its own. I don't have time to tell you. But there we were marginally better off, but I still succumbed to typhus. And a few others did. And I remember lying on my upper bunk by the window. I must have sort of been conscious by then, and I was looking out and I saw people running. And all I could think of is, I didn't know why they were running, but I thought, how have they got the strength to run? And that was the day of liberations, the 15th of April 1945, when we were liberated by the British. Now, I haven't got time to tell you exactly what happened afterwards, but I can't leave that without saying how wonderful they were, how they sort of approached the whole thing, and how they tried to save lives, and they really worked hard at it, because some people were beyond saving. And so we were lucky. We were now liberated, and what they did was to transfer people to hospitals and so on.